Each man must do his bit.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. We're so happy that you can join us. I'm Gabriela Patram. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and lead of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you.
It's always a pleasure to be on the program, Gabby. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sir, today we're just going to have, wanted to chat with you a little bit generally about some of the interests in Guyana. And on that note, my first question is, the PPP administration in its first year in office, they have engaged in several defense and security agreements with foreign countries. What is the objective of these defense and security agreements?
It's a complex question because they all have different objectives. For example, there've been agreements with France and Suriname, that agreement is. But it took some people by surprise because they certainly don't know what the agreement contains. But it is something to do with the Guyana Shield strategic dialogue. I'm sure many Guyanese are not aware of what it means. And then we've had agreements with the United States, starting with Mr. Mike Pompeo's visit last September 2020. And they heard about the ship rider agreement. And then I think the Adjutant General of the Florida National Guard came here, and he signed an agreement, and then we had the United States sponsored trade winds exercise. Another admiral came, I think Admiral Fowler, and he had he signed an agreement with Brigadier Best about provision of services. And then you had, there was an Indian agreement for the provision of training courses. So each one is different. The agreement with Suriname and France, the agreement with India. In fact, it's an old agreement because it's called ITEC, and several officers have gone on ITEC courses before. United States, we've had trade winds over 30 years. So some of the agreements are old, but they seem to have come all together within the last year. What I would say is that there might be a perception of renewed interest because of the geostrategic importance of Guyana and Suriname. And as you know, the petroleum industry is largely, for the time being at least, offshore. And both Guyana and Suriname are regarded as potentially major suppliers of petroleum in the Western Hemisphere. And it is not too far-fetched to assume that France, United States, well, India has interests as well, are careful about protecting their investments offshore Suriname and Guyana. So these are some of the strategic or geopolitical concerns that these powers have. In addition to that, countries like the United States, United Kingdom, try to prevent narcotics from getting into America and the United States from South America. So they try to provide the type of assistance which will help governments to interdict narcotics in their own countries. So it seems like assistance, but actually they're helping themselves by preventing drugs and criminals and unwanted migrants from going into their own countries. So the agreements are possibly, aimed at different purposes. The Indian agreement, as I said, has been going on for over 30 years. The American trade winds, the French is relatively new. We've had relations with France before. But in addition to that, we've had relations with Brazil and China, defense relations. But these two countries have been relatively silent during this period. This last year under the PPP administration seems to have been dominated, if I can use that word, by agreements with the United States.
Sir, the engagements between the Guyana and United States seem to have been more prominent.
Yes.
Why are they playing a greater role in Guyana's security at this time, or maybe over the last year?
There are various aspects to that question. To start with, in 1823, there was a United States president called President Monroe, and from that president we got the expression Monroe Doctrine. So from that time, United States exercised some hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. And although it is no longer a valid form of diplomacy, you know, people still remember the Monroe Doctrine as being a declaration of United States resistance to other countries, European countries, from, you know, exercising too much influence in South America and certainly in the Western Hemisphere. So there's this lingering aura of the Monroe Doctrine. But the visit of Mike Pompeo last September, you know, was quite disturbing because he made some comments which were seen as being hostile to the People's Republic of China. Mm-hmm. And the ambassador for PRC in Guyana actually responded. Mm-hmm. And his comments were quite undiplomatic. In fact, Mr. Pompeo, although he's basically a foreign minister, he was treated like a celebrity. There were big billboards, yeah, and, you know, motorcades, and but he's gone now. And it seemed that he came to attack China. In addition to shipwright agreements and all that, he came to ensure that the country of Guyana and Suriname, again Guyana and Suriname, why did he choose to visit these two countries? That is a zone of petroleum exploration and perhaps great profitability. And I wouldn't separate Mr. Pompeo's visit from the prospect of petroleum production in Guyana and Suriname. And at the same time, he was at pains to make remarks which are regarded as offensive by the People's Republic of China. So there was a strategic objective to his visit. And I believe that the petroleum production prospects in Guyana and Suriname were not far removed from the objectives of Mr. Pompeo's visit. So you're looking at national interests. He didn't come here to help Guyana. He came here to help the United States. I mean, let's be frank. And it is in the United States' interest to ensure that the petroleum production and, you know, the control of the petroleum industry does not provide a forum or a foundation for Chinese exploitation or entry into the Guyana's market. So it is big power rivalry. And if you look at what Mr. Pompeo was doing for most of 2020, and not only in Guyana and Suriname, but in other places, it was to attack PRC. And I'm not saying Guyana is on one side or the other side, but what is clear is that American interest is not unrelated to its desire to gain advantages over the People's Republic of China. So it's a USA-PRC battle, and I just hope that the Cooperative Republic of Guyana doesn't get squeezed between the two giants.
Sir, can we talk a little bit now about the relationship between Guyana and Brazil? We would have shared, or we are sharing, strong defense relationships for over 50 years now. Are there any signs, or what are the signs of a change in strategic defense planning?
There is an apparent change, I wouldn't doubt that. As I said, I think, well, I was trained in Brazil, you know, and many officers, at least 2 GDF chiefs of staff, were trained in Brazil. Brazil has the largest army on the continent, over 330,000 members of the armed forces. It is the power on the continent, and Guyana has a 1,300-kilometer border with Brazil. I've always found it prudent, when I was president and when I was commander of the GDF, to have good relations with Brazil. Brazil is very helpful. A couple of years ago, when there was a very bad drought in Rupununi, Brazil sent their construction engineer battalion and dug several wells, and Guyanese engineers, military engineers, trained along with the Brazilians in order to, dig wells in Rupununi. So Brazil has been a very strong friend. There are written agreements. I have hosted visits by the Brazilian defense minister, and Brazil set up something called the South American Defense Council. Brazil was very involved in bringing some stability to the relation between, I think, Ecuador and Colombia. Brazil is for peace. Brazil had thousands of troops in Haiti. Brazil was responsible for the last phase of the United States mission in Haiti. So it is impossible to speak of defense and security in this hemisphere and on the South American continent without considering Brazil's influence. What has happened, I cannot say, I'm not in government, but it seems that the military or the defense relation with Brazil is quite muted at present. And I don't know if it's a deliberate act of policy or if it is a matter of neglect, but I feel that Brazilian relationships must be nurtured and they must remain, healthy if Guyana is to enjoy security on all of its borders. We have 3,000 kilometers of border, and we know that the relations with Venezuela are still a bit unsettled. Relations with Suriname are still unsettled, and Brazil has always had a stable relationship. There are no territorial claims from Brazil. And in fact, Suriname, several years ago, expelled the petroleum exploration platform from Guyana's waters. Venezuela, up to early this year, there was some maritime incident, siege of fishing boats. But Brazil's relations with Guyana have been very solid, very, very stable. I don't know if there's a change in policy, but Brazil has been a good friend, and we should always cultivate good friendships on our borders.
So on that same note, Guyana, we've seen a lot of, we have seen a lot of social commentary and so on, have certain territorial defense and border security concerns. What is expected, or what is the expected effect of these security agreements with different countries?
In my perception, Guyana's the main defense or national defense consideration is the territoriality, the security of the border, territorial integrity. That said, I do not see that some of these agreements will have any significant impact on the security of Guyana's borders. For example, the United States has had relations with Guyana from the time of independence, but we have been struggling, gasping for breath, for years, and we have never really gotten any serious defense support from some of the Western powers. And we were more or less on our own. In 1969, the aggression by Venezuela, the attempt to secede by the Rupununi, it was supported by Venezuela. But we were on our own, and all of our military establishments, our training schools were built on our own. Although we get a training course here or a training course there, substantially, Guyana has had to carve its own way in terms of defense policy. So these agreements, it's good to send a few people, a few officers to India to train, but it doesn't substantially add to Guyana's defense machine. We pay for the equipment, and we've gotten a lot of equipment from China, but we need much more, and we traditionally over the years we paid for everything we've got. So I do not see that any of these agreements will impact on the territorial security of Guyana, which is our core interest. That is what it's all about. That is our main national interest. Bear in mind that the maritime conflicts we've had, in which Venezuela expelled petroleum vessels and Suriname expelled petroleum platform, we got no help from anyone. We had to go to the court to deal with the Surinamese matter. And as you know, the Venezuelan matter is now before the court. But none of these agreements will impact Guyana's territorial integrity. Even Shipwriter, these are things which America wants to cooperate with Guyana, or in fact Guyana cooperates with America to ensure the security of the maritime zone. But they will not have any measurable impact on Guyana's security. At a strategic level, it won't have any big impact. It's nice. It's nice to send an officer on a course here, officer on a course there, send somebody to West Point, send somebody to some staff course there, but this is not, defense, national defense is much more than that, much more a course here and a course there.
So taking in everything, what is the objective of this administration national defense policy? They have issued a 4-pillar national defense policy. What is the objective of this policy in your interpretation?
In my view, I probably wouldn't call it a national defense policy. Okay. I think that expression is misplaced. I think policy, it is elementary. It is not, it's not strategy. When you speak of individual benefits for soldiers, housing, that's not defense strategy. It's necessary, but it's not strategy. It's elementary. Then I think the president mentioned 4 I's. The institutional, yes, you need to build institutional capacity. You need to build international relations. You need to have integration with society. These are all elementary parts of military planning, everyday planning. But these are not the pillars of a strategy or a policy. I don't know if he's going to come up with a more substantial statement, but as I said, it is an announcement he made in the National Assembly, I think, earlier this year. And maybe he has not time to, or his advisors have not had time to craft a strategy. Because what is happening now, when you look at the flurry of agreements, all of these agreements, training and Shipwriter and the agreement with France, all of these have to be integrated into a holistic policy. And then, of course, a few weeks ago, we had this regional joint support team. So nobody could be quite sure, where we're heading in this so-called national defense policy with these 4 I's. They're important, but we need more substantial information to decide whether it's a policy or just an approach. But it's not enough. It's elementary stuff, and perhaps he intends to add on it later. So I don't want to judge, the policy on the basis of what has been uttered so far.
But sir, like you just mentioned, most of these agreements, or a lot of them, the defense and security agreements, it's difficult to discern when we don't know what it contains, and as you mentioned just now, where we're heading and so forth. Mm-hmm. What is Guyana's national interest based on all these agreements and so forth, or in general?
A country's national interest is usually defined by the government. Um, there's no written statement what is our national interest, but you know, at a simple level, I can say what's best for Guyana. People in Guyana want to be safe, they want to have secure borders, and our national interest is in doing the best for our people, to protect them from attack, from aggression, and to ensure that the borders are secure, should be our objective. Now, in coming to that statement or that conclusion, the government must decide what is the threat. Is the threat, in the maritime zone? Is it, from fisheries? Is it from overflights? Is it from pollution? Is it from illegal migration? What is the main threat? And if that main threat is the loss of territory, well, if you have no land, you have no, there's nowhere to live. So I would say let us look at the core threat. Following that, once you define the national policy, it informs your foreign policy. If you know what your core responsibility is, it will tell your policymakers, your foreign service officers, your diplomats, where to put their emphasis. And Guyana's diplomats, or Guyana's diplomacy has always been, first of all, based on the three neighboring countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and Suriname. We've always had embassies there, and we've always tried to make sure that those embassies are fully staffed. And of course, they have consular responsibilities because many Guyanese go to Brazil, Venezuela, and Suriname, and all three countries have some form of consular presence, handling passports. So the definition of the national interest is a very important foreign affairs tool. For that reason, for example, when I was president, I visited both Brazil and Suriname. And as you can see, over the last year, the president of Suriname and the president of Guyana exchanged visits. So when we're looking at the national interest, therefore, we're looking at ensuring that the people of Guyana feel secure. And that is paramount. But Guyana too must develop the capacity to fulfill its agreements and obligations. We sign a lot of agreements, but our foreign service, our foreign ministry, must have staff. And one thing you should know about Guyana is that there's actually no Ministry of Defense. From the time of independence, the Prime Minister at that time has always held the responsibility for defense. And when we became an executive president, when we had an executive presidency after 1980, the president had responsibility for defense. So in addition to the ceremonial role of being Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, he also had a functional role in terms of chairmanship of the Defense Board. And the Constitution provides that in any event that the ministry is not, or a responsibility is not assigned to a minister, the president would perform that responsibility. So by default, he's also a Minister of Defense. So he has three responsibilities: Commander-in-Chief, Chairman of the Defense Board, and Minister of Defense. But there's actually no Ministry of Defense. While I was president, I had created something called the Department of Defense. Defense is very complicated. It spends millions and millions of dollars. And the Army itself must be given a clear focus on operations and administration and planning for border defense. And sometimes some of the bureaucratic functions could be left behind. So it is my view that there should be a Department of Defense, which is as part of what was then the Ministry of the Presidency, which comes under the President himself and which helps to do some of the spade work in defense. So without that, Without that, I do not think it will be possible to discharge the functions of defense planning adequately, particularly in the complicated situation we are now. People are acquiring helicopters, they're acquiring boats, a vessel. That we will make mistakes if we simply go on the market buying stuff without a plan. A few years ago, in the early 2000s, we bought a boat, which is a minesweeper. It is not a coastal patrol vessel. It is not a fishery protection vessel. So we will end up getting the wrong equipment if we have the wrong plans or we have the wrong intention. And that is why it is important for us to define our national interests. It's important for us to have a proper national defense strategy so that when we enter these agreements with France or China or Brazil or United Kingdom, all of these agreements are part of a plan to secure the national interest. If we don't have that definition clear in our minds, I don't think we'll have a successful defense policy. And that's one of the reasons why we don't need a Ministry of Defense, but what we need is a Department of Defense, which I think helps the President to make the right decisions. And you need somebody or a team, which is impartial and which could look at not only equipment, but also relationships with countries, which can look at these agreements that we are signing and maybe inform the public better. Because for defense to be successful, there needs to be a holistic approach, and the public needs to be informed. If they're going to be part of the militia, if they're going to be part of national defense, the public has to know what they're going in for. And right now, there's very little information about the relationship, the agreement with France and Suriname. There's little knowledge about what shipwright is about. Even trade winds. People feel trade winds is a huge exercise, a huge success, but actually, there's a lot of shooting and minor tactics which could be treated, which could be given to soldiers at recruit college, recruit school. So it is not a big strategic exercise. So there needs to be much more defense planning if we are to protect our national interests. And as I see it, it's not happening as yet. But it's just been a year, and I expect that after this flurry of agreements, there'll be some more serious planning for the long term.
Well, sir, as I mentioned, it's always a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for being here. And to you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we do continue to encourage you to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.